2019 is one of the most bizarre times in the history of wrestling for so many reasons that it'd take an entirely separate video just to explain why. But when I say bizarre, I don't mean that in a bad way, because for the first time in a long time, wrestling's finally exciting again. And the news of Paul Heyman becoming the executive director for Monday Night Raw, with Eric Bischoff getting the same job title for SmackDown, is probably the most bizarre and interesting thing to happen this week. If it had happened any other year, people would have made a much bigger deal about it. But then again, in 2019, weird things happened in the wrestling world every day. And if you feel like a complete moron for not knowing what an executive director is, then don't. Because I don't think anybody else even knows what it means either. But what it's supposed to mean is that basically, Paul Heyman's gonna be running Raw while Eric Bischoff's running SmackDown. And it's not like it's gonna be an on-air general manager role or anything like that. This is supposed to be the real deal, with Vince McMahon being the only person who has any authority over them. All logic would dictate that this has been in the plans for a while, but apparently most WWE personnel and even Fox were just as surprised as the rest of us. And when you look at things like the wildcard rule popping up from the same place as Randy Orton, Samoa, and Spike, then the idea Vince McMahon just pulled this out of his ass in like 5 minutes isn't really the craziest thing ever. After all, it's a bit convenient that this news breaks the same week Stomping Grounds got the company's lowest buy rate ever. And on top of that, attendance and ratings are still dropping at an alarming rate. The question of how long it took for this idea to go from conception to reality doesn't really matter though, because at the end of the day, it's happening. So now the biggest questions seem to be, when will Heyman and Bischoff start? Will they be able to push whichever wrestlers they want? How often are they going to have to work with each other? Who gets dibs on the NXT stars? And where does Triple H factor in, among many other things? But my biggest question is why Bischoff and Heyman are being given such prominent roles seemingly out of the blue. So let's take a look at the 5 most likely reasons, starting with number 1, the XFL. With 3 hours of Raw, 2 hours of SmackDown, frequent pay-per-views with 8-hour pre-shows and 16-hour events, more talent to talk to than ever, and probably a million other things we don't even know about going on every week, the upcoming revival of the XFL in January is probably going to be way too much for a 74-year-old Vince McMahon to handle, so it does make sense that he'd bring in some extra help. But many people, including myself, assumed it'd be Triple H gaining more power and that it's a big middle finger to him to let a guy like Eric Bischoff get the spot instead. Because for the past 87 years or so, he's just been retired and hanging out at home. If the middle finger theory's accurate, then I guess the rumors are true that Vince and the cerebral assassin haven't been getting along after countless NXT stars keep getting buried on the main roster. But whether that's the case, or Triple H is just trying to keep a good thing going with NXT, Bischoff and Heyman kinda make sense because... Number 2. They've both been successful in the past. Out of all the years Vince McMahon's been in control of WWE, nobody's ever been able to pose as great of a threat as Eric Bischoff. Granted, he wasn't able to do the same thing in TNA without Ted Turner's budget, but it did take a lot more than money to knock Vince on his ass, so it wouldn't be fair to sell Bischoff short. And even though a lot of people, including Fox, are skeptical with Bischoff, seeing as how WCW got really bad in the later years, not to mention he hasn't been watching very much wrestling lately, I still think Bischoff's a smart enough guy to have learned from his mistakes. If nothing else, he knows how to talk to TV networks, so it makes sense that he'd be working directly with Fox in regards to SmackDown. And while ECW always struggled financially under Paul Heyman's leadership, I actually think it's more impressive that he was able to do as much as he did with how little he had. And given that Heyman's been helping WWE's creative out lately anyway, then I think he's actually going to hit it out of the park as executive director. I mean, he has had 2 really bad falling outs with the company with SmackDown and ECW's revival, but seeing as how Heyman turned the same role down with TNA and apparently a similar role with WWE recently because he wasn't going to get full creative control, something clearly had to have changed his mind, although it could just be that he's older and wiser. One would think that they're going to give him more control than anybody's ever had in the past. Although, Bill Watts was offered creative control in 1995, but he ended up quitting because Vince just kept getting involved anyway. So you'd think Heyman's smart enough to realize that even if Vince promises him full creative control, that he's never going to give it up, even if he is busy with football. But something tells me that Heyman might be able to fully execute his vision this time around. Otherwise, I don't know what it is that convinced him to take the gig. Even if you're skeptical of Heyman's potential ideas, though, I think we could all agree that anything's probably better than the WWE product as of late. But even though somebody had to alleviate the impossible workload from Vince, it's still pretty funny that he gave it to Heyman and Bischoff since it's been over 20 years since they made their marks. Which brings us to... number 3. Vince McMahon is stuck in a bubble. As if we needed any more proof that Vince McMahon has no idea what's going on outside of the universe he owns. Hiring Heyman, and more specifically Bischoff, to take control of his flagship shows really tells you everything you need to know. Granted, there really aren't that many people in the world to hire for this type of job, but back in the 90s, Eric Bischoff said himself that WCW needed young blood in control and not the old Bill Watts regime. And it's funny how WWE's constantly painted the picture that WCW was completely incompetent and just got lucky with the NWO angle, and now they're hiring Bischoff. But be that as it may, there are still other people who could have taken the job, like the aforementioned Triple H, who's been specifically preparing for this role with NXT. Like I said, it kinda makes sense for Heyman to take over one show since he's been helping out with creative anyway. But it is weird that Vince McMahon's giving control to the only other guy in his bubble that he knows of, despite the fact that WCW eventually went out of business. I guess people really do look to the past through rose-colored glasses. Oh well, I still think Bischoff would do a better job than Shane or Stephanie would've. No offense to them, of course. Number 4. Desperation. WWE is still making a lot of money off their TV deals in Saudi Arabia, but other than that, everything else is declining, which is probably concerning for shareholders as well as the USA and Fox networks. So what do you do when people start panicking? Well, anything at all, because it creates the illusion that something's being done even if it doesn't make sense. Kinda like how airport security started putting their hands up people's asses after 9/11. It doesn't stop any terrorists, but because something's being done, it makes people feel a little more safe. Don't get me wrong, this desperation response isn't that crazy, but no matter how I look at it, Bischoff being brought back from the dead certainly comes off as desperation, because everyone knows that Bischoff and Heyman had success in the past, and people are suckers for nostalgia. I mean, look at the movie theaters right now. They're playing Child's Play, Toy Story, Men in Black, and Aladdin, and with AEW becoming more and more of a threat, then why not bring WCW and ECW in as backup? Which obviously brings us to... Number 5. Preventing Bischoff and Heyman from going to AEW. If Paul Heyman was able to do everything he did with ECW with as little as he had, then just imagine what an older and wiser Paul Heyman could do for AEW with the Khan family's budget. And like I said, Bischoff didn't do a whole lot for TNA without a billionaire's checkbook. And he did ultimately fail when he had that with WCW, but failure could be the best teacher. And with Bischoff also possessing knowledge of the inner workings of WWE, you can imagine that he'd have been a big help for AEW, even if he wasn't there in a high power position. At the very least though, Bischoff's still a potential threat in the mind of Vince McMahon, so obviously he wouldn't want him going to AEW. But they probably could have kept Bischoff from going to AEW by giving him any job at all, kinda like how they basically paid Jim Ross a lot of money to just sit at home and do nothing. But even if Bischoff ends up shitting the bed, it's still gonna be fun to watch. But I'm honestly optimistic that he along with Heyman will do a good job, just as long as Vince gives him close to full control. Because if he's not gonna let them fully implement their ideas, then why even hire him in the first place? Realistically though, Vince is never gonna give full creative control up as long as he's alive. I mean, the guy doesn't surrender to his own sneezes or even sleep. But even though he's obviously going to be overseeing everything, I hope he leaves Bischoff and Heyman to their own devices. Because even if they fail, you'd think Vince would want that to happen now while he's still alive, rather than 50 or 60 years into the future when he's not. At the very least, let's just hope this kills the wildcard rule once and for all. What do you think about Bischoff and Heyman taking their fictional jobs from the early 2000s as real jobs? Do you think Vince is going to give him full control? Do you think it should have been Triple H? Or should it have been somebody more qualified like Dixie Carter or Vince Russo? Either way, let me know what you think in the comments below and I'll respond to everybody. Don't forget to subscribe to prove to the world what a sexy beast you are. And if you want to help this channel grow, then liking and sharing really goes a long way. My name's Kayfabe Cameron and I'll wrestle you next time.